When it comes to direction, we want to arrive at the destination yesterday, not be still trying to get the engine started. So for me to recognize that, hey, some of the culture change that I want to see happen is probably more a matter of decades than days, helped me do some appropriate expectation setting to be a little bit more patient and recognize, hey, this is going to be long-term work, and I'm going to really have to be committed to staying the course in the ups and downs, including in those seasons where I feel discouraged.
I'm Trisha Taylor, and this is the Leader's Journey podcast. I'm glad you're back for the third installment in this series. We've been talking about strengthening our immune systems, emotionally speaking. So kind of based on the idea of growing our resilience as leaders, just as humans, in the same way that the immune system of our body helps us to deal with threats to our well-being that come from outside or come from inside, pathogens and injuries and all those kinds of things, that we can take that same idea and apply it to our emotional life and growing our emotional resilience. And so that's what Mac McCarthy and I have been talking about lately. We've been basing this on the book, How Your Church Family Works by Peter Steinke. It is a classic applying the principles of Bowen family systems theory to just the functioning of church life, congregational life. It applies really well to lots of systems outside of congregations. And Steinke makes the point that there are ways that we can deliberately strengthen our emotional immune systems for ourselves and also for the organizations that we lead. And so I'm glad you're back. If you haven't already, I hope you'll go back and listen to episode 1 and episode 2. But today's episode does stand alone. And I know that you'll enjoy this conversation between me and Mac.
So we're in this series where we're looking at 7 health influencing responses that Steinke gives us at the end of one of his books. And we've coupled these into 3 categories, and we've covered the first 2, focusing on yourself rather than others. So sort of leading yourself. And then secondly, relating to others. And in this third episode, we want to talk about navigating the system. And we hope to cover 3 of these health influencing responses in our conversation today. The first is to focus on process, not just content. The second is to focus on the entire system, not just symptoms. And then the final one is to focus on direction, not just the current condition. So let's jump into the first one. How would you explain what Steinke is getting at when he says, focus on process, not just content?
I think this is one of those skills that it's hard to learn. And then once you learn it, it gives you access to levels of leadership that you literally didn't have before. And it focuses on this idea that we tend to focus on the what, the decision that we're trying to make, for example. Let's say we're trying to make a decision about our finances and the what. And that's where we get stuck. And that's where the quicksand is. And that's typically where the system starts getting really anxious. If we can somehow shift to the how, so for example, not what will we decide, but how will we decide? Not what is the right choice, but more, what are the things influencing how we're making this choice? It just gives us access to something beyond the power struggle.
Yeah, where do you notice, can you give an example of where maybe in coaching a client or in your own, where you're like, this is what I'm talking about?
Yes. So for example, as a consultant, I'm often going into a situation where people are very stuck on a particular task they need to do. They need to make a decision. Let's just use money as an example, because money is a perfect example here. And they think that the problem that they're having is related to making the right decision about how to spend their money. but that's not actually where they're stuck. Where they're stuck is in the process. Who gets to decide? Whose ideas matter more than other people's ideas? How are we listening to each other to make sure that, we are actually coming to a decision together? What's actually happening in the room right this minute as the anxiety is going up? Can I stop and say, I'm noticing right this minute that, um, that we've heard of even the simple question of, does anyone else see this differently, is a process question that allows maybe some other voices to come into the room when up to this point it's been dominated by one person or one group or one point of view.
Mm-hmm. You just used a word that I think would be important not to breeze past. You said, what would happen if we stopped?
Yes, there you go.
I just think that in and of itself is really hard to do when you're feeling anxious or there's anxiety in the system. It seems that part of being able to pivot from focusing on just the immediate decision that needs to be made to the process requires that we slow down, which is so difficult to do when anxiety is high.
Yeah.
It seems that one of the impacts anxiety has on us is it sort of weaponizes the tyranny of the urgent, where we become enslaved by the immediate, and we think that we need to take action immediately. But in order to focus on process, in order to do what you're describing, we have to stop, we have to slow down, and we have to create space. And I wonder if that might be the hardest step when all the pressure in the system is saying, relieve the tension, make a decision, you need to act now.
I love the scene in the movie A Christmas Story, where Ralphie is seeing Santa Claus and Santa Claus pushes him down the slide and Ralphie puts his hands and his feet out to the side to stop his slide down, just so he can say his one last thing to Santa, right?
Yes.
I mean, that's the mental picture that comes to my mind when we think about stopping. And then in our stopping, to shift the focus from the what to often what is happening right now in this moment. So people who are very familiar with my work are going to laugh when I mention the question, so how are you being? Or sometimes I will say, how did you be? And people can stop and they can say, oh, I see, I'm really over functioning right now. Or I just checked out and I'm actually making a grocery list in this meeting. I'm not even paying attention anymore. Or I'm very invested in trying to get everyone to see my point. Or I'm sitting here being cynical thinking, it doesn't matter. None of this matters. If we can get to some of that stuff that's in the process, that's in the room with us right now, I think that's some of what it means to shift from content to process.
Yeah, so a health influencing response is to slow down, to stop. A non-anxious leader is going to create time, and in that extra space that's created, they're gonna attend to how we're showing up and relating to one another, the process that we're participating in that may be working against us or for us.
Yeah, exactly. Which hopefully helps us pull out of some of the autopilot reactivity that's happening in the room and lessens the power struggle. Because often what's happening is everyone in the room thinks they have the right perspective and they're advocating for that. Or sometimes I think even shifting to process when there's doesn't seem to be much energy in the room. So I'm noticing nobody wants to talk. Everybody's just kind of sitting there. Like I could call on you, but it makes me really curious what's going on that everyone is silent.
Maybe one next step to live into this that I might suggest from my own experience is when you're not anxious, develop a process that has integrity with your team so that when things are anxious, you have something to live into together. That has served me so well. The challenge is to remember when we're anxious, oh, we have a process, and now's the exact time we need to live into it together. And it may not look perfect, but we're gonna do our best.
Give me an example of what might be in that process.
Yeah, I think I circled around some of it when you're discerning. A handful of episodes ago, I named some like when you're with your leadership team and there's differing opinions. You're in a crucial conversation where there's differing opinions, emotions are high, and the stakes feel significant. There's anxiety, and that's when things can go sideways. So to have a process in place where you can say, hey, we have some guiding principles about how to stay defined and connected with one another. And we have a process that supports that to make sure everybody is heard. It's time to live into that as we contemplate this decision. I've had to do that with probably a dozen scenarios in the last 5 to 6 years with our leadership team. And the key thing for me is we are focusing on the what. We are focusing on the decision that needs to be made, but we are equally focused on the process to help us make it with integrity. And I've named before that for us, I often will have people write down what they think, how they would define what they would do if it were just them. And usually after a week or two of prayer, so sort of a prayerfully informed conviction. And everybody has to write that down before they share anything so there's not influence. And then we go around and everybody listens to one another. That'd be a simple way you can normalize staying defined and connected when there's anxiety. Pushing some people would rather get on board with what other people are saying to define themselves. And it also maybe prevents some of those people who tend to take up all the space to actually have to, you get 3 minutes and then you have to listen to everybody else.
I love that because in that case, the people in the group are still very focused on content. But you as the leader are being very intentional about shaping the process.
Yes, that's right. I'm assuming that's part of your leadership responsibility is less to tell people what the choice is. Here's the right choice. And it's actually more to facilitate the process with integrity that helps you get there together.
And leaders are busy and they've got lots of meetings. And I think it's very easy not to spend any time at all thinking about process, to go from meeting to meeting to meeting, really just focusing on content and trying to get everybody on the same page or toward the decision. I wonder how many leaders really think about how will I go into this meeting? How will I set up the process? How will I guide how we do this work?
Oh my goodness. I would say that probably, well, for me, and I'm making up a statistic on the moment, but like I would say over 50% of my mental space is about the how at this point. How are we relating to one another? What process are we? Because that's where the growth happens. If it's not just focused on what we end up doing, but who we're becoming as we do it, then my responsibility as a leader is to give a lot of thought and intention about how I'm leading and how I'm inviting other people to show up.
When I go in as a consultant, I spend a lot of time at the beginning or maybe in some pre-work trying to build the container to help everyone come to some kind of agreement about how we'll do our work. In other words, how we'll treat each other, how we'll manage conflict, where the boundaries are, but also when it comes time to make the decision, how will we make that decision? Is this going to be majority rules? Is this going to be, 80%? Does this need to be unanimous? Will we vote? Will we, cast lots? What are we going to do to do this? And then also, I want an agreement before we even start discussing what will we do afterward if we don't, if our point of view doesn't prevail. And people get really irritated by this because it feels like a waste of time, right? Because they are, they didn't hire me to do all this work. They hired me to help them get to a decision. But this process, in my view,
it's worth it. I
is
would
what has
suggest if you're still hanging in there on this episode, I would encourage you to rewind a minute and a half to 2 minutes and listen to all the things that Trisha just named regarding what she has to do on the front end of working with a client or a leadership team to ensure that the proper process is in place so that we can be confident in the right outcome. That checklist you just gave was, I think, really significant.
Then on the back end, I do something similar to what you just described. I call it reading the room. Mm-hmm. Everybody has sticky notes with 4 different colors. And at different periods of time, we stop the discussion to just kind of see where we are. Sometimes often a period of solitude if this is a really momentous decision. And the 4 colors are yes, but I still have questions and reservations. Mm-hmm. No, I'm blocking this. I'm not willing to go forward. And I would stand aside. Like mm-hmm. if everybody's going to go this way, I would stand aside. I don't agree, but I'm willing to set that aside. And I can remember at least a couple of times where in the middle of really serious conflict discussion, we stopped to read the room that way and discovered we were actually all pretty much on the same page.
Oh, wow.
And when most people are saying yes, but I still have reservations, that tells us where the process needs to go.
Yeah, that's a really intuitive move to go, hey, time out. Everybody define themselves for a moment. Oh, we're actually like, we might be talking past each other, but we're actually largely in the same quadrant here. So we just have to massage some things rather than, face off with each other.
We've got 7 people in this room that are prone to block what some of us are spending a lot of time on.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what are we going to do about that? So process to tilt toward process over content is just a way to give us more choices.
And oftentimes the content, I think, is way more complicated than we realize, which leads right into the second one, which is focus on the system, not just the symptom. Oftentimes we have a way of, even when we do skip over process and we kind of want to just attend to content, we're oversimplifying the content, which leads to poor decisions. And so this second health influencing response, I think, is really important, that healthy leaders look beyond just the symptom to the entire system that's producing it.
Again, it's very counterintuitive. If what you've got is a symptom, people are acting out in some way, there's negative emotion, there are trends in the organization related to things like people and money and so forth, it's very easy to want to focus on the symptom. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Which is why the skill here, I think, is the ability to get up to the balcony.
Yeah.
I think the skill is the ability to get ourselves to a point where we can see the whole. I'll give you an example. Sometimes when a pastor or a governing body in a church will get in touch with me about a symptom, let's say the symptom is we don't have enough people and we don't have enough money. And they are often very focused on, so how do we get more people and how do we get more money? Right? And in particular, how do we make our pastor do the things that will bring in more people and more money, or get rid of this pastor and find a pastor who will? Right? That's very often the job.
Yep.
And one of the things that I will often do early on is bring in the trends of congregations all over the country for them to locate their particular issue with a much wider trend than just what their congregation is experiencing. And very often they have not looked at it. If they have looked outside their situation at all, they have only looked at the church that is doing way better than they are. Yep. They have not looked at what is happening on a much wider basis.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. The challenge is that symptoms, I think, get the most attention. and yet the system is creating those symptoms. So how do we look at the system when everything is screaming at us, just relieve this symptom? That's the rub, right? And I think you're right that the key move here is to get to the balcony and be able to look at the larger picture and to notice patterns that the symptom by itself isn't going to give us. I also think that the whole distinction between maybe technical challenges and adaptive ones is really significant here. Because oftentimes we, at least for me, most of the leadership literature I was exposed to early on treated everything like a technical problem that could easily be solved. And the longer I've been leading, the more I realize that the challenges that end up on my desk that I am having to attend to conversationally very rarely are technical in nature. I have very awesome people surrounding me. And so if it's a technical problem, they're likely going to figure it out without any need of my assistance. But the struggles and the issues that are surfacing for me are usually adaptive in nature. They're way more complicated. There aren't known solutions. The underlying causes are murky at best. And when I reach for a technical solution, usually I'm ignoring the system and I make it a whole lot worse.
The perfect example of that is when the pastor gets up and yells at the congregation because people aren't there. He or she is yelling at the people who are there about how not enough people are coming to the church.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, it's a symptom-focused move.
Yes.
In the moment, it feels right because it's born out of the frustration and the anxiety, but it's laughable, you know, when you can see what you're doing.
Yes. It's like the small group leader who chews out those who come on behalf of out of frustration. I cleaned my house. I made these brownies and you guys don't even show up.
Yes, exactly.
You
but
know,
that's just a silly example of focusing on the technical and not the adaptive.
Yeah. One of the things that I have been learning from Paul is, and I mentioned this in our last episode, we're preaching through 1 Corinthians. We're only in the first chapter. But the Corinthians are divided, and commentators debate and hypothesize the variables that were contributing to that division. But the most straightforward reading is that they were following or attaching themselves to different apostles and sort of then competing for influence in the community. And one of the things I've been noticing about how Paul pastors is he rarely treats the problem as the problem. He doesn't just attack the symptoms. He often points to the root of the issue. And it almost is always theologically formed. It's not just behavioral, it's theological. So for instance, in 1 Corinthians, he doesn't just try to get them to get along. The solution isn't to give them a conflict training seminar. He actually says, look, you don't understand what it means to be aligned with Jesus, because if you did, you wouldn't be giving your allegiance to other leaders. And you don't understand the cross because the cross is about self-sacrifice, not about powering up to gain influence over each other. I name that just to go, I think Paul was far from a perfect person. You can kind of see some of his snarkiness come out in his letters. But like the point is that, I'm actually learning from Paul how he was doing this, albeit imperfectly, as he's working with these messy congregations. He's not just confronting the symptom. He's going deeper underneath the surface to help them see how this all connects together.
We were talking just a little while ago on the previous point about money. You know, our conversations about money in our families, as well as in our congregations and in our companies, is not really about money per se, not the actual numbers. You know, there are so many other things that are part of that conversation. As you said, deeper or underneath that, being able to get to that. I think often negative emotion is what, or maybe behavioral acting out is what everybody wants to focus on. You know, make these bad feelings go away. And yet, if where this is a systems, kind of a law of how systems function, wherever we put our anxious focus gets worse. That is just kind of, it's like the law of gravity,
Yep.
it just
Yep.
is. And so we think we're being really strategic and helpful by laser focusing all of our anxiety on this symptom that we want to change. And what we know is that we can literally predict that when we do that, that symptom will get worse. It just will. And
Yep.
I didn't make the rules. That's just how it
Yeah.
is.
Well, and one exercise, I think, to get that balcony view and to treat things adaptively rather than just technically is to just do like a 5x5 exercise. And so, for instance, a lot of churches are looking at how sports are competing with a church involvement and participation. I mean, it seems like nowadays you have to select which sport your kid is going to be a professional athlete in by 18 months old and get them into traveling, whatever. And so I've experienced this conversation with our leadership and staff. Like, how do we fix that? That's the question. How do we fix the symptom of kids' sports overriding church participation?
Let me guess. You make the parents feel guilty about putting their kids onto these teams.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah. Exactly.
Okay.
And look, there may be a conversational angle around priorities and rhythms as a family, and I'm not saying we ignore that. But a great exercise is to go, why are we seeing younger families not attending church or participating in the way we want? Can we name 5 of them? And very quickly, you'll have like kids' sports might be one of them, but you'll identify other ones as well. So all of a sudden, you realize it's not just this one thing, it's other things. And then if we look at the 5 you identify as a group, what are 5 reasons that are causing that? And within about 15 minutes, you'll have 25 reasons. And that can be disempowering in some way because all of a sudden you realize it's way more complex than I was thinking. But it also, I think, exposes the silliness of reaching for this one thing that's going to solve this problem that's obviously way more complex. Like if we just had sprinkled covered donuts every Sunday, then the kids would come back. Like that's not going to work, right?
Yeah, exactly. Or if we just make the parents feel guilty enough, or if we put together our own Christian sports league, or, I'm just, it's the different ways that, I think in a parallel to that is in every system is when we focus on the symptom, we move almost immediately to blame. And blame almost never encompasses all the complexity that you're talking about.
Yes.
It almost always takes us down a more anxious path where we just, sometimes almost explosively increase the amount of anxiety in the system. I think about the negative emotions too, or the acting out. If we can think of those things as smoke alarms rather than as the problem themselves. If my smoke alarm goes off in the middle of the night and I get that this has happened and I get super focused on making the smoke alarm go off without checking to see, is there actually a threat in the environment? I mean, we can see how silly that is.
Right. Right.
But that's exactly what symptoms are. Typically, they are the alarm going off, not the problem itself.
That's right. That's right. I see this last one that Steinke names as almost like a combination of everything we've been talking about, which is focusing on the direction, not just the condition. It seems that if you're going to do this, you have to bring together a lot of what we've been discussing. How would you fill that out for our listeners?
I think a lot about our congregation. I mean, in one sense, if we only looked at our condition, it's pretty dire. We're a small congregation. We're mostly an elderly congregation. The writing is on the wall for our future. Maybe not our immediate future, but eventually. I'll give you just an example. We We run about 70 or 80 in person, maybe another 20 online.
Okay.
And we did a special Sunday for everyone over 90, and we had 11 people to honor.
Wow. Yeah.
Regular attenders
Of your
over.
80. Yeah.
Yeah. So, you know, that just gives you an idea of that. And yet at the same time, Craig will tell you he has loved serving this church
Hmm.
as pastor because they have just been brilliant in terms of focusing on their direction. You know, these are the things that we believe in, and this is how we will pursue those things. And, you know, I mean, we have young families coming in, we have babies in the nursery. There was a time we wouldn't have imagined that, but there was never a time that the leadership said, okay, we've got to grow. Come on, everybody. We've got to figure out how to grow our church.
Hmm.
But instead, there has just been a really steady, principled focus on what are we doing here
Yeah.
and how do we want to do it better?
So it doesn't ignore the condition, but the priority is placed on direction. As Craig has led this community, what's maybe one of those principled convictions that is rooted in direction on who you're becoming as a church that has served you all well?
You know, I think one example would be they have a very strong focus on wanting to serve the part of Houston that we live in.
Hmm.
And the reality is that a lot of the people in our congregation are just not physically able to do all the things they used to do.
Mhm.
And so they have found new things to do, new partnerships with, you know, groups in our part of town and what they're doing. And they found new ways to channel that. And now some people are coming in and saying, well, but I'm physically able to do that, and taking on some of that work, rather than saying our condition is such that we can't really have an influence here anymore.
Here's what's bubbling up for me as we're talking about this last one, and maybe maybe it's just me, but perhaps other pastors and listeners can relate to this. Is one of the primary temptations I face as a leader is the temptation of discouragement. It's not every day, but there's seasons where you get tired. There's some accumulative fatigue that sets in, and you kind of look at the condition of your congregation out of all the energy you've been putting into it, and it's just tempting to go like, is what I'm doing worth it? Is it
Yeah.
making any meaningful difference? Why am I giving my life to this? And that is a condition type focus, right? I'm sort of locked into the present moment, sucked into just looking at the condition rather than getting on the balcony and looking at the direction we've been going. And I know that for me, again, not every day, but there are seasons where I can get I can get thrown into the pit of discouragement. And usually what helps me climb out is to remember, no, this is the direction we're going. Of course, it's going to be challenging. God works slower than I'd like. And that includes in my own life. And, you know, and I'm going to keep going. I'm going to keep
Mhm.
going.
Because you can see you're not where you were. Everything isn't completely different, but you're not where you were a year ago or 5 years ago. Or is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, that is what I'm saying. I think that so like healthy leaders who are focused on the direction, not just the condition, don't ignore the condition. They don't ignore reality, but they don't completely allow that to define reality. We have somewhere where we're going. This isn't the end of the story. There's more that God has for us. I wouldn't probably still be in ministry if it weren't for having some sense of direction that I sense God calling me to, and the hope that God is going to bring us out of this mess that we're currently in. I've shared in previous episodes that we were a church of 1,800 and went through a church split as our pastor was fired for kind of Mark Driscoll behavior, abusive, toxic leadership, and then planted a church down the road that functionally split our church. If I had just looked at the condition for the first 6 months or 2 years, I would have thrown in the towel. It would have been so easy to do so because there were no signs or indicators that this is fun, this is great, this is
Yeah.
like, right? Um, but underneath it was this sense of this is an opportunity to become healthy. This is an opportunity to reset the culture. This is an opportunity for us to grow as a community and become the kind of community where this doesn't happen again.
Mm, I love that, Mac. That's a perfect example. I hope that's encouraging to people. Now, what happens if the direction isn't in the direction that we hope
Mm-hmm.
it's going? And
Mm-hmm.
that makes me think of a company where they are working on, I mean, the trends were such, it wasn't going in that direction. And they really took on the flywheel model, that idea that sometimes you have to put your shoulder hard to the wheel and push hard, and it doesn't move for a while.
Mm.
And I was in some of those meetings where it wasn't moving, but they stayed very focused on this is what we're doing. Yes, we want to get better at it, but we're not going to stop and change direction. And they've been pushing hard. And Jim and Nate and I were at a meeting just recently where it was obvious the flywheel is starting to turn.
That's awesome.
And
Yeah,
I wonder
I
about the discouragement of those leaders, though.
right. I had on my whiteboard for probably 2 years, and I seriously read it every day. That line that Todd Bolsinger made famous, like "Stay calm, stay connected, stay the course."
Mhm.
And I just kept recycling that because in our anxiety, we want, again, sort of immediate relief from those symptoms. And when it comes to direction, we want to arrive at the destination yesterday, not be still trying to get the engine started. And so for me to recognize that, hey, some of the culture change that I want to see happen is probably more a matter of decades than days, um, helped me do some appropriate expectation setting to be a little bit more patient and recognize, hey, this is going to be long-term work, and I'm going to really have to be committed to staying the course in the ups and downs, including in those seasons where I feel discouraged.
Yeah. I think that is a terrific place to end this pod and this series because we have gone over 7 ways that leaders can take on a more health producing, immune system strengthening approach, largely by shifting our focus, largely by moving what we're looking at from one thing to something else. And I don't know if we can do all 7 at the same time. So I want to encourage, well, obviously, I want to encourage people to go back and listen to all 3, to do it in a reflective way, looking at your own life. We've talked a lot about congregations, but I want to encourage you to take these principles and apply them to wherever you're serving as a leader.
Or
And to
your
make,
family. I mean, at the
yeah,
time of recording this, it's going to be Memorial Day weekend. I've got family coming in town. These 7 health influencing responses are going to be gold,
there you go. Get to focus on weaknesses and on strengths, not weaknesses,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Um, but and then to say, so first of all, where am I going to not just take in this information, but where am I going to practice it? And what will that practice look like? And then where will I reflect on my practice? And that's pretty much what we're about at the Leader's Journey. So if we can be helpful to you, we'd love to see you on our socials or at theleadersjourney.us. And this has been a lot of fun. I'm really glad that we talked this through. Yeah, we will see you next time. Take care.